Good morning. Bonjour. So lovely to be here this morning. My name is Fortin LeFaivre, and I'm Vice President of Strategic Policy and Global Partnerships at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I'm here with 5 distinguished panelists, 2 of whom are in person and 3 joining us virtually, including a guest from Japan who's joining us in the middle of the night. So special shout out to that participant. So this morning we're going to talk about the trade security nexus and what that means. So we know that broadly it's the convergence of global economic policy and national security considerations on the surface. But what does that actually mean in practice? How is that manifesting itself, especially in the Indo-Pacific? And what does it mean for Canada? What are the specific takeaways that we can get from this session? As we know that there are many government policy officials here, as well as business people. So what are the takeaways that we can get from our 5 experts? So we're going to start. I'm going to give a brief introduction on the background of our panelists, and then they will each have a few minutes to go a bit deeper in terms of how their work relates to that topic. And then we'll go into different rounds of questions, and we'll try to save about 15 minutes or so at the end for questions from the floor. So we will start with Mr. Robert Hanlon, just to give you a brief introduction. Mr. Hanlon is the Director and Principal Investigator of the Canada and the Asia-Pacific Policy Project at Thompson Rivers University. He is also Chair of the Department of Philosophy, History, and Politics and an Associate Faculty Member in the School of Humanitarian Studies at Royal Roads University. Mr. Hanlon?
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm from the Kamloops-Secwepemc area in which is Kamloops, BC. Very privileged to feel as a guest here on the Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And thank you very much to the organizers for this. I'm very excited to be here. So I'll just give you a bit of background of where I come at this issue. And I'm an academic, but I wear multiple hats. And I never thought I would be an academic. I actually began thinking about trade and human rights when I worked for the Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. But equally, at the same time I was working for the Chamber of Commerce, I was working for a human rights organization also in Hong Kong. And the work that we were constantly addressing was corruption in not just China, but also mainland Southeast Asia, different parts of the region. And I noticed the business community and the rights community were talking about the same problems with rule of law. And so that kind of led me down this pathway to looking at rule of law and corruption, specifically in gaining market access. And so my background specifically looks at how companies have gained market access using what we might say non-traditional business means to gain that market access. And so this is how I kind of got into this topic of the politics of corporate social responsibility. So for me, the trade security nexus is very much in line with trying to understand non-traditional business risk and how it's politicized or not politicized. And specifically in the current context, I'm interested in the over-securitization or the over-politicization of trade. And my approach to this, which I'm happy to talk about this morning, is how all things are now falling under the security umbrella strategy, if you will. And this is, it makes sense. I understand why this is happening, but at the same time, I feel that it's creating a very kind of muddled and confused response in how to think clearly of risk, balancing risk with opportunity. And I'll just give you a quick story, and to kind of contextualize this, last May I had the opportunity of getting a tour of the Huawei factory in Shenzhen, and we had a remarkable facility. There's no one at Huawei that is under the impression that that security is not a concern for their company, and this idea that their supply chain and their access to North American markets, they are fully aware that they are being that they have very legitimate concerns here, and that they want that they have to look for new markets, and they are. They have this wonderful car, this Alto car, the Huawei car, which it looks like a Porsche, but it has a Tesla interior. It's like this. And I said, are you going to try to sell this in the North American market? And they said, no way, because no one will buy this. No one will trust it, right? I think the tech's too, is too much concern. But at the same time, you might have heard of another company, and so this is being a legitimate security concern, right? And for all countries, not just Canada, in the context of techno-nationalism. But at the same time, you might have heard of another company called Shein. And Shein is a $100 billion company, $100 billion. If you haven't heard of it, ask your children. They probably know it. They probably order their clothes on Shein. But Shein is becoming heavily securitized as well. This fast fashion company that's popped out of seemingly nowhere, it came from somewhere. But if you want to know kind of the politics about it, go online and search up Stop Shein. And this organized, there's a campaign to stop this company, and it's got this wonderful banner when you look at the first website. I mean, it's a remarkable website where it starts, it says TikTok is the needle, Shein is the drug. And so we're seeing the securitization of fast fashion now. So my point is that this is kind of just one example of the muddling of all things coming under this security, this strategy umbrella, which I see as problematic for clear thinking on this area, and I'm happy to talk a lot more about this.
There's so much to unpack, so thanks for starting there. Kristen Hopewell, welcome. Kristen is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Global Policy in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and Director of the Liu Institute for Global Issues. She is also a former director of the Center for Chinese Research. Her research specializes in international trade, global governance, industrial policy and development, with a focus on emerging powers. Kristen.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks to the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. So when we're thinking about the securitization of trade, the trade security nexus, I think it's really important to look at what's been happening at the multilateral level, look at the multilateral trading system. We talked yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about what's been happening with the liberal order, with the rules-based order. And really in the economic realm, the multilateral trading system is the core pillar of the liberal order and the rules-based order. And this liberal order has been critical to ensuring stability and order in the global economy, and also ensuring peace for much of the past 70 years. The issue that we're seeing is the WTO, the multilateral trading system, has been thrown into profound crisis. So we have, on the one hand, a breakdown of the WTO's core negotiation function. So the ability to negotiate new global trade rules, to govern trade, to govern global commerce, has essentially collapsed, in large part due to conflict between the US and China and their growing rivalry. At the same time, we also see the two biggest powers in the multilateral trading system rampantly violating the rules of the system. And in perhaps what's the most acute or immediate threat to the rules-based trading system in trade, what we've seen recently is the core dispute settlement function of the WTO. The WTO's enforcement mechanism really come into jeopardy because of the US blockage of appellate body appointments. So the appellate body essentially functions as a world court for global trade. It's an appeals court. And since the Trump administration, but continuing under Biden, the US has been blocking the appointment of judges to the appellate body. So the WTO's appeals court has been unable to function. And what that means is a country that loses a ruling at the WTO can block that ruling, prevent it from coming into force and becoming legally binding, simply by filing an appeal to this now defunct appellate body. So this has huge implications for the trading system. What this means is essentially WTO rules have become unenforceable. And we've seen, in addition to the rise of economic nationalism, protectionism from the US and China, increasingly, because WTO rules can't be enforced, this is also spreading to other countries, including some of the big economic players in the Indo-Pacific region. So most recently, there have been a slew of cases at the WTO against India. India has been rampantly violating global trade rules in a whole host of different areas, doing things like, for example, providing massive volumes of export subsidies. So these policies have been challenged at the WTO. They've been found to be in violation of WTO rules, but India has been able to appeal into the void, basically to appeal to this now defunct appellate body and block those rulings from coming into force. Something similar we've seen with Indonesia. Indonesia has been engaging in a number of very, protectionist trade policies, including in minerals. Indonesia has been restricting the export of raw minerals. This too is in, excuse me, blatant violation of WTO rules. But again, this has been successfully challenged at the WTO, but Indonesia has been able to block the ruling by appealing into the void. So this is somewhat ironic, given that the US is now trying to cozy up to Indonesia on critical minerals, that Indonesia has, first of all, as was mentioned yesterday, Indonesia's mining sector, both mining and processing, is overwhelmingly dominated by Chinese investment. But at the same time, Indonesia has also shown a real willingness to take advantage of its very central role in some critical minerals to essentially cut off the tap to global markets. So we're seeing this from big players, India, Indonesia, and one of the issues too is that this very much creates a demonstration effect, where other countries are watching what's happening, seeing these players breaking the rules and getting away with it, and therefore are becoming more likely to do the same things themselves. So there's a real danger right now. We're sort of at a critical juncture. The global trading system is really on a precipice, and there's a real danger of a descent into disorder and lawlessness in the system. So I think this is really critical for understanding the context, for understanding trade right now, and the emerging dynamics of trade in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thanks for providing that context, and I'm sure we'll solve all of it in the next 45 minutes. Stephen Nagy is joining us from Japan this morning, if I'm correct.
Yeah, it's very early. It's about 12:10 in the morning here. So good morning to everyone in Ottawa.
Well, thank you very much for staying up so late for us. So Mr. Nagy is professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo. Previously, he was a special research associate at Waseda University and an assistant professor at the Department of Japanese Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is currently working on middle power approaches to great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. Stephen?
Thanks very much. So I was asked to speak at least openly about how I understand the trade security nexus. And I'm looking at it from this region and actually seeing how trade has been, I think, weaponized on the one side. And on the other hand, we've seen disruptions associated with trade that has affected security. And good examples is the 3/11, the March 11th earthquake and tsunami in Japan, but we've also had geopolitical events in the East China Sea with the arrest of Chinese fishermen causing rare earth embargoes, and most recently, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. So as we think about the nexus between trade and security, there is a strong political or geopolitical dimension that we've experienced, and Australians and South Koreans and Canadians and Japanese have all experienced the weaponization of trade affecting their security. But I think we should also put it in the context of a growing understanding that the interconnectedness of global supply chains and the production network that's largely based in China is extremely vulnerable to natural disasters and, of course, political choices. And again, in the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw how political choices and a transnational disease fundamentally disrupted not only regional supply chains, but global supply chains. Now, this is interesting in terms of how we understand it in terms of security, because at least in this part of the world, the idea of economic security has really grown in currency. Understanding that a country's security is not just about borders and numbers of ships and boats, but how resilient their economies are, how resilient it is to coercion, but also how well it can manage challenges to disruptions in supply chains. And with that, what we're seeing in this part of the world is a growing momentum to try and build resilience into the regional production network by one, selectively diversifying away from the Chinese market. And I use that expression very explicitly, selectively diversifying, because it's not in the interest of any countries within the region to decouple from China. But there is a strong understanding that having too many eggs in the China basket could be a liability. And as a result, countries, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Australia, Southeast Asian countries, are thinking about how they can diversify their trading relationship with China, while at the same time engage with China and deepen that relationship. And I'll likely come back to this point about a non-zero-sum approach to China, where they're engaging, they're building resilience into the relationship, but also thinking about deterrence. The idea of economic security bridges technology, it bridges supply chains, and it bridges dual-use technologies. And here again, we're seeing resilience being built into the supply chains in those 3 or 4 areas to try and, again, create opportunities to continue to leverage the opportunity from the biggest economy in the region, an economy that, even though it's slowing, is going to continue to grow, has a large number of middle-class consumers that are interested in buying the products that are being produced within the region, but at the same time, understanding how these economic connections, again, can be weaponized or exploited to create different relationships within the region. So with that, I think, again, as we look at the trade security nexus within this region, I think we should step away from this zero-sum approach and thinking about decoupling to protect trade and security. And again, think about how countries within this region are engaging with China, finding ways to build resilience into the relationship with China, at the same time find ways to create deterrence in their trading relationship to ensure that they can benefit from the opportunities of this relationship, but also understand and create some protection from the weaponization of the relationship as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll move to David Talbot, who is the Associate Director of Economic Policy at the Milken Institute. He previously served in the Obama administration as policy advisor for international economics to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, playing a central role in designing the Secretary's commercial diplomacy strategy. David?
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm sorry I couldn't join in person. As Catherine mentioned, I am in the process of launching a geoeconomics initiative at the Milken Institute, where we're focusing on critical issues around climate finance and issues including de-risking and critical emerging technology. And previously served in the Obama administration, where sort of was there and experienced and helped craft this initial U.S. pivot to Asia, which is continuing to play out. For better or for worse. So that's where I'm going to focus my remarks mostly today, because I think sort of U.S. economic statecraft in the region is continuing to shift, and it's really at a critical inflection point since it was initially announced in 2011. So if you look back over the last 10, 12 years, it's very clear that the U.S. has succeeded in building and strengthening a regional security architecture. You've seen some major wins over the last few years. I think the sort of rise and emergence of China has really helped U.S. officials build a lattice work of new defense pacts. So you've seen the Quad, you've seen AUKUS, and you've seen the strengthening of bilateral relationships with key partners in the region, such as Vietnam and the Philippines. And I think perhaps most importantly, you've seen the development and the emergence of the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral partnership, which really has been, I think, foundational for U.S. Security posture in the region, and also for what's happening within the region itself. I think, as everyone's probably aware, the economic component of this strategy has proven much slower and far more complicated. So clearly, the American-China strategy has emerged and has continued to evolve, really a critical shift during the Trump administration, which the Biden administration has maintained the tariffs. I think really continued to escalate. We saw some pretty bold comments from Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo over the weekend, which suggests that the Biden administration plans to continue to escalate its sort of the protect portion of its protect and promote strategy when it comes to China. But particularly when you look at U.S. Economic statecraft in South and Southeast Asia, the administration is trying to fill the vacuum that was left by the failure to ratify the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is an agreement that Canada is part of, the CPTPP. And I think a real challenge here. You know, some of the critiques of U.S. economic diplomacy in the region, I think, are overstated. I think that, like on the security side, U.S. has turned to minilateralism to fill both sort of the inability to complete a major regional agreement and also a number of the challenges at the multilateral level that Kristen mentioned that the U.S. is in part a driver of. You look at the Quad, you look again at that U.S.-Japan-Korea partnership as examples of multilateral progress. I think some really important issues there. I also think that some of the original critiques around the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which we can get into a bit more later, the Biden administration's attempt to sort of fill this TPP void, were overstated. I think that there are clear issues and challenges from a negotiating perspective, not including market access. But when you actually look at the trade data over the last 3 or 4 years, what's happening at the macro level, including CHIPS IRA, some other components which had some self-imposed damage, I think, by having restrictions and protectionist components have really driven a huge deepening of U.S. economic investment and trade with the region. But that being said, I think the recent breakdown of IPEF negotiations on the trade pillar is a very major blow to U.S. approach to the region, which creates a real turning point here. A question for U.S. policymakers, and I think for other countries that are like Canada, that are looking to ramp up their engagement in the Indo-Pacific about what the U.S. strategy is going to be going ahead. And I think a lot of that is going to depend on what happens in the upcoming election. So look forward to diving into these issues a little bit deeper. And thank you again for the invitation to join today.
Thank you, David. And I hope we have time to talk a little bit more about IPEF, because certainly it's been in the news in the last couple of weeks here in Canada in terms of why Canada has been not invited to join thus far. So last but not least, we have Arie van Assche, who is full professor in international business and director of the International Institute of Economic Diplomacy at HEC Montreal. He is the editor-in-chief elect of the Journal of International Business Policy, a fellow at the Academy of International Business, research fellow at Cyrano, and fellow in residence at CD Howe.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you already for the very nice opening remarks. What I would like to add to the discussion we've already had is that the heightened focus on security issues in trade policy discussions has also been leading to new types of policies that we've not seen used as much before. And I'd like to indicate a bit how it works and what some of the concerns that I have with it. So I call these types of policies global value chain reconfiguration policies. And so what these policies do is you've got a government that is pressuring companies to rewire their global value chains extraterritorially, and they're doing that in order to reach certain goals that they set themselves, which could be related to security, it could be related to other values that they're putting forward, but they're really being used quite a bit, and they do lead to a number of unintended consequences. So just to give you an example of where this is happening, the United States a couple of years ago put into place the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so ultimately what this act does is it pressures companies to cut Xinjiang out of their global value chains if they want to be able to sell in the US market. And the reason why the government is doing that is in order to compel China to no longer use forced labor. You can look at the US Chips and Science Act. So in this act, you've got a number of guardrail provisions, which indicate that if a company receives money from the US Chips and Science Act, they commit to not develop any significant transactions that will help build up China's semiconductor manufacturing capacity. So what you have here is ultimately the United States trying to cut China out of some of the value chains of some of the most sophisticated semiconductors. You can look at the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. So in the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. is pressuring automotive manufacturing, electrical vehicle manufacturing companies to move the final assembly of the cars, move the assembly of electrical vehicle batteries to countries outside of China, for example, to Quebec. And they're doing that because they're worried that China's high concentration and focus on the assembly of the batteries is leading to choke points that they cannot control. So these are three different examples. One thing that you're seeing in common in all these examples is that it's a new pool that is exploiting the globalized nature of production for economic warfare purposes. And so they're very interesting tools that have been used in the past, but not as systematically as right now. But they do lead to a number of issues that we have to be worrying about a bit. So the first one is that these policies are tools for economic warfare. China sees these as tools of economic warfare, and of course they are retaliating with very similar actions. So China right now has created a unreliable entities list, which ultimately has a lot of U.S. firms that now are no longer able to do business in China, but also no longer able to extend their global value chains into China. You also have China, and this was mentioned a bit earlier, putting some export restrictions on critical minerals that are being used for electrical vehicles, for example. And so ultimately what China is saying is, look, if you are threatening, or if you are pressuring companies to move the making of electrical vehicle batteries away from China, then we are not going to give them access to the components that they need for their production. So you're seeing a bit of a fight emerging here. And you can see that this is really started to have an impact. So I read a couple of days ago that there was some concerns by Republicans about some of the clean energy transition policies that the U.S. is being, that the Biden administration has been putting into place. And one of the main concerns was that it was making us much more dependent on China, which was considered to be something that was a worry. So that's kind of a first concern that you can see with that. The second concern is that a lot of the countries in the Indo-Pacific, they're looking at this and they are worried about these types of policies. And the reason why they're worried is because a lot of these countries in the Indo-Asian Pacific, on the one hand, have a strong political relation and economic relation with North America, but on the other hand, they also are increasingly becoming dependent and working with China as well. And so they don't like to see policies being put into place where they have to choose between one of the two countries, where they either have to go with the United States or have to go with China. And so there's some disgruntlement about what is going on there. A third concern that I see with this, and this was also mentioned previously, is indeed every time that you have governments putting into place certain policies that are requiring companies to move away from certain countries. This leads to concerns about discrimination. The moment you hear discrimination, you start hearing people at the World Trade Organization saying, look, maybe we should be doing something about this. Right now, as we just heard, this is not as easy to do as before, but as more and more countries are starting to do this and are seeing that this actually works, there is a concern that any efforts of trying to revive the multilateral trading system that we have developed might be undermined in the process. So we're digging a bit the hole of not being able to revive the multilateral trading system in a way that we have liked to see it in the past. So these are concerns that I see with these global value chain reconfiguration policies.
That's fascinating, Ari. Thank you. So perhaps this is a good segue into a first question about friendshoring. We've all heard about friendshoring. Even in Canada, Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland has mentioned it on many occasions. How is this, perhaps shifting a bit to the Canadian context, is that a good thing for Canada? in terms of critical minerals opportunities, it would seem that it is. Could you perhaps comment on that? And then I'll ask the question to the other panelists, and I'll go to Kristen after that just to change up the order.
Sure, thanks. So in my opening remarks, I was talking about one type of policy, which was global value chain reconfiguration policies, which really are trying to address security concerns by harnessing or controlling or manipulating global value chains. And we look at these policies and we think that this might be a right approach to go, because very often we are seeing trade and global value chains and international business as something that is driving security concerns, which means that we have to be addressing them. We have to be very careful, though, in pushing this too far. And somebody else also mentioned earlier that right now security is everywhere, and that maybe sometimes it's going a bit too far. The reason why I'm indicating that is because it is by no means always the case that trade is leading to security concerns. In fact, actually, it used to be that we saw trade or global value chains as being something that can lead to more security. There is a vast literature about how conducting more trades leads to more dependence, that leads to a higher opportunity cost of war, and therefore there has been a strong argumentation that trade is very good for peace. But I'll go a step further to that as well. So somebody in the opening remarks pointed out that global value chains have led to a lot of bottlenecks, and so as a result of that, we need to be doing something about that. But ultimately, actually, a lot of the previous literature has been pointing out that when companies are creating global value chains, they're not just doing that to reduce costs, even though it is a very important factor, but they're very often times doing that in order to increase security. In order to increase flexibility. So if, for example, I'm creating a global value chain where I'm importing some components from one country and other components from another country, what happens is that actually my company is much less vulnerable to shocks that are occurring at home, to shocks that are occurring in one country specifically, or shocks that are occurring in another country specifically. So a lot of companies have been doing this for a long, long time. One thing that companies did, for example, was say, well, we are going to create a China +1 strategy, because doing that creates this type of flexibility. I'm indicating this because one term that the chief economist of the World Trade Organization, Ralph Ossa, has been using quite a bit in recent months has been the word flex security. And so what he's indeed trying to point out is, look, trade in many, many cases, not in all, you're right, so that in the case of critical minerals where China is responsible for 95% of their supply, it's very difficult to diversify, and therefore trade can lead to serious problems. But in many, many other cases, actually, trade can be a critical vehicle for security, and we have to make sure that we're not forgetting that as we are developing policies towards this trade security nexus.
Thank you, Ari. Kristen, any thoughts on friendshoring? Is it an opportunity for Canada?
I would agree with everything that Ari just said in terms of the risks of this push towards friendshoring, the potential, security benefits of trade relations among states. I wanted to speak specifically to the critical minerals issue, because this has been such a big focus in Canada, and it's also come up quite a bit in our discussion over the past 2 days. And I think we need to be really careful. I think the critical minerals discussion in Canada in particular has probably been a bit overblown. And this is an area where we need to exercise a bit more caution. One issue is just the timeline. In terms of trying to scale up our exploitation of critical minerals, we're looking, it's 10 to 15 years to bring these types of mines online, and then to develop the processing facilities for these as well. This is not something that can be accomplished overnight or in any kind of short time frame. So this is very much a slow, long-term project. And the other danger with this too is that Canada is not the only one seeking to develop its critical mineral resources. There's a rush around the globe right now to try to develop these minerals. And so there's a real risk of creating a sort of classic commodity boom-bust cycle with these minerals, as so many countries are seeking to develop lithium or other mineral resources. So making these massive investments, we need to be very conscious of sort of the wider dynamics and again, this risk of a boom bust cycle, and we make huge investments in this area and don't actually see the returns that we're looking for. So a note of caution on friendshoring, particularly on critical minerals.
Thanks for that point. We have heard a lot about critical minerals, it's true. So, Robert, your thoughts on friendshoring, that concept? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree again with everything said, and you know, it makes me think in a concerning way, kind of the language and the risk of the language around decoupling, and it's really a time that there's been, you know, we're in a time of increased, I don't want to say bloc politics, but it is out there, and this is, in my view, something that is concerning to, again, this idea that we were using, you know, global supply chains and this and globalization as a means to create wealth. And yes, there was a lot of gaps in that. Yes, there's a lot of problems with it, but this reverse to friendshoring, decoupling, I see it as concerning, and it's in the realm, again, I think, of this strategy world, and I appreciate and I understand the strategy world, but strategic, you know, competition, the language that's kind of out there, it makes sense, but for me, I prefer language. I had an opportunity to interview a former director of the Asian Development Bank a few years ago, and he was telling me his preferred term was competitive pluralism, and the idea that, you know, competition was good and different countries had the right to different approaches, and so you know, and he was speaking in the context of at this time, the development of the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but the point is that, you know, it was time to get all hands on deck with whether it was infrastructure, whether it's, you know, increasing wealth. And so I do have concerns over friendshoring. I understand the rationale. I understand the importance of diversifying supply chains and adding value, but I think we have to be cautious of the language.
Okay. We'll go to David in Washington.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. You know, I think a theme that's emerging here throughout these comments is, you know, figuring out how to strike the right balance between security and integration, which is spot on, and frankly something that I think a lot of policymakers are still working through as well. I think in the U.S. context, this is particularly important, this ongoing challenge, because the sense that I get is that there has been, you know, already did a great job of breaking down this true paradigm shift in sort of U.S. domestic and international economic policy. And I think even if you do see, you know, a return of the Trump administration in the next election, or a continuation of Biden administration, that you're going to see this as a persistent shift in the U.S. international economic landscape. So, you know, the Biden administration started with the 100-day supply chain reviews, which ended up sort of having this focus on semiconductors, lithium batteries, medical devices, and then minerals and materials, as we've heard a lot about here. And I think, you know, it's the attempt to develop a more proactive response to pair with the huge extension that you've seen of sanctions and export controls as this attempt to reconfigure global supply chains. The extent to which it's an opportunity or a challenge for Canada, I think, has been well captured here as well, where the U.S. is really engaged in a very active, proactive minilateralism within the North American context, within the USMCA platform, in South and Southeast Asia, in its relationship with Europe. So you're seeing in all of these different economic fora this new sort of prioritization of supply chain resilience, and there are some real risks there. I think a big one is that sort of the U.S., when you look at it through the U.S. lens, the goal is to try to find as many new sources for these, particularly within these 4 critical areas that were identified by the Biden administration. So, you know, the incentive is to get as many partners as possible to be sort of producing or trying to make themselves attractive for investment in each of these categories. So, you know, take what Kristen was saying about critical minerals and multiply that across sectors. And I think that there's a real concern here, particularly when you look without sort of greater strategic prioritization, if you look 5 years down the line, that a number of countries have invested very significant, resources, probably a combination of sort of structural reforms and subsidies and incentives to try to develop these new industries, and then there not being much of a market for it. So I think that there is a need for, I think, DC to further clarify what these priorities are, who are the key partners in each of these areas as identified, and then go from there. That being said, I do think that within key sectors that are already part of Canada's comparative advantage, and particularly you look at the IRA, you look at the auto industry, that there is very clearly a what is going to be a long-term shift in U.S. policy change that creates opportunities. And I'm optimistic, although I also have some concerns, that the U.S. is finally going to start really investing in a North American regional strategy. I think, you had NAFTA, you had USMCA. I was part of some efforts to build out an original policy dialogue sort of underneath that to make sure that the three countries were fully capitalizing on it. You've seen the Biden administration now launch the successor to that earlier this year alongside the North American Semiconductor Conference. There's a new North American Competitiveness Ministerial. And I think that there is a opportunity here for a real deepening of the trilateral relationship, depending on where things go next.
Thank you. Stephen, from the Japanese perspective, I know from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's standpoint, our CEO, Perrin Beatty, was just in Japan and Korea. He brought a delegation of Canadian businesses. He was there with Minister Ng. Lots of talk about the urgency of doing more between Canada and Japan. So is friendshoring an opportunity there for both countries?
It's obviously an opportunity for both countries, but also I think Kristen and Ari really laid it out quite well. There's domestic challenges in terms of opening up the critical mineral supplies of Canada, both from the standpoint of getting the resources out of the ground, processing them, but also how do we match our quite evangelistic environmental policies back home to the realities of the challenge of getting these minerals out of the ground. And this is where I think the opportunity comes in with our Japanese and South Korean partners, as they have the technologies, they have the capital, and they may be able to, these partners may be able to create new kinds of minilateral or bilateral relationships where we can friendshore and use these partnerships to, again, insert technologies to accelerate some of the resource extraction, but in a more environmentally friendly way. So I think as Canada is looking at reshoring and looking to partners such as Japan and South Korea, I think that they have to fine tune, what kinds of technologies they need, what kinds of businesses on this side of the Pacific they want to work with, and how they can be used to leverage, I think, the incredible resources that Canada has, but again, be in line with, I think, Canada's efforts to contribute to the climate change challenge, contribute to being an energy or critical minerals security superpower. And I think that, again, there's lots of opportunities here. It's just finding the right formula, the right match between businesses in this part of the world to the businesses in Canada to, again, leverage our natural assets.
Thank you. So I'll move on to maybe a more practical question. We know, as I mentioned in the room, no doubt, many global affairs officials and other Canadian department officials, as well as business leaders and civil society. I'd like to ask the experts, what are your recommendations? What should be their takeaway of this discussion? How do they put into practice the recommendations that you've discussed in line with the Indo-Pacific strategy? So that's part one of the question. Part B is for those who operate a business in the Indo-Pacific or are considering it, or even who operate domestically but know that the supply chain impacts and the geopolitical happenings will have a domestic impact in Canada as well. So what kind of recommendations would you give? And I will start with you.
Sure, thank you. I think, the IPS, there was a great discussion yesterday on this, on its framework and its vision and just what it sets out, but it is, in my view, kind of just the beginning. And trying to, what we might say, what I know what the Asia-Pacific Foundation and other organizations call competency, and raising kind of Indo-Pacific competency within Canada, as was called a whole of government or whole of society kind of understanding of Canada's role in the Indo-Pacific, that how engaged we are. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of leadership in making those decisions across different governments, but not only federal, but also provincial. I see the IPS, there's language in the IPS that talks about enhanced supply chains, and we talked about, and the language around forced labor comes up, and I know we've talked about this in the context of China, and China's mentioned 51 times in that document. But if you want to talk about supply chains and labor, you look at some of where our core kind of exposure is on especially in the kind of the garment or ready-made fashion industry. And you look at Bangladesh is not mentioned once. Sri Lanka is not mentioned. And so when you think about our supply chains, I think a lot of the work on enhancing the competency around that strategy is really getting the balance right. That it's not a document about China, it's not a document just about India. There is a bigger picture at play. I think it's going to come from not only that, but also from the private sector. And the private sector is already heavily engaged in Asia. There's a lot of opportunity. Just recently, even in China, at the China International Import Expo, just this fall, there was 73 Canadian businesses there. 5 provinces were represented, and so that stuff's happening on a more provincial and local level. And so I think enhancing that competency of those groups is really kind of a neat approach, and thinking about more those people-to-people connections.
That's a great point. Certainly we're seeing that interest at the subnational level as well. So maybe I'll go to Ari, switch things up a little bit.
Sure. So
go ahead.
So my main point I would like to make is that for companies, you might be hearing a lot of discussion about security and about all the different global value chain reconfiguration policies that we already discussed. But this is very much concentrated in specific sectors. If you go to other sectors, actually, there is just very little evidence that it is changing a lot of trade in global value chains. One thing that really struck me was when Stephen Altman from Columbia released his DHL Global Connectedness Index a couple of months ago, was that he found that ultimately, except if you look at the specific relation between US and China, where there has been a decline in trade and foreign direct investment and migration. If you look at the rest of the world, there's been virtually no evidence of any decoupling, deglobalization, or anything going on. So this is really important that we're getting a lot of political focus on security issues. I do think it is a little bit of a political dynamite because of the reasons I indicated. But for most of businesses that are wanting to go to the Indo-Pacific, they should not be affected very much by these issues.
Okay, good to know. Stephen, any thoughts on this? Recommendations?
Yeah, I guess I'd break it down into like something about knowledge, something about branding, and something about information sharing. And in terms of recommendations for knowledge, I think Canada really needs Canadian Indo-Pacific chairs across the country to build faculties that can build, that cadre of young Canadians that will be inserted into the business community, that will be inserted into the government, and will have knowledge about how integrated this region is, how heterogeneous the region is, and how the region wants to trade. And they prioritize trade, and they prioritize a non-zero-sum approach with challenging countries like China. And I think that is an important starting point. Branding is another area, and I think that this takes some synergy between the business community and the government. what is Canada? What is our brand? What do we bring to the region? This is a real challenge. When you talk to people within the region, they like Canada. They like to have holidays here, but they don't really know what we produce and what we bring to the region. So I think we need a more effective branding. And the trade missions are great. Minister Ng was just here in Tokyo a few weeks ago. We need more of this. We need more sustained engagement within the region. And I guess the third area is information sharing. And I'm part of our Canadian Chamber of Commerce here in Japan, and we host something called the Canadian Chambers of the Asia-Pacific, where we get together every month and we share information about the region. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot recently is support through the Canadian Indo-Pacific Strategy for chambers of commerce within the region. The challenge here is that the chambers represent their members. They don't represent the Canadian government or the Canadian Indo-Pacific Strategy. So as Canada is willing to support chambers, they have to understand that the chambers are supporting their own small and medium enterprises within the region. They're happy to engage in information sharing. They're happy to help the Canadian government, but they're not necessarily interested in representing the Indo-Pacific Strategy or Canada. So I think helping them share information, helping understand the chamber's roles in understanding the region, helping create, again, this information sharing complex amongst the chambers can help Canada better engage in the region, have sustained partners with experienced Canadian small and medium-sized enterprises that are in the region.
So capacity building, marketing, information sharing.
Absolutely.
Easy enough. Okay, David. Sorry, go ahead.
Stephen, was there something you wanted to add on the end there?
Stephen.
Perfect. So the main one that I would focus on here is government capacity. I think it's clear that as part of this sort of economic paradigm shift we've seen in the US, again, I think Ari did a great job of breaking it down on the domestic level, also the international level. You're seeing new demands on government that requires new expertise. This global supply chain reconfiguration is a much different game than traditional export promotion or trade negotiations. So you don't have those traditional skills, at least in the US context. A lot of the tools have not been used in a long time. A lot of that expertise doesn't exist internally. So whereas for something like export promotion, you're basically just talking to industry and then trying to figure out how to help them access new markets. There is a deeper level of industry knowledge and awareness required, in part because a lot of what's being done is not necessarily in the interest of those traditional customers that you have for a trade ministry or for a commerce department. We actually saw this in full force over the weekend when Secretary Raimondo was speaking at the Reagan National Defense Forum, where she took a very strong line against some of the pushback that the Commerce Department's been receiving from U.S. semiconductor companies about the new China export controls and new sanctions, and the way that companies have responded to those by trying to work and operate around them, by trying to sort of rush sales out prior to the sort of implementation deadlines and everything else. And she said that during this pitch that, it was basically a call to increase funding for BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is the sort of component of the Commerce Department that writes and then implements U.S. export control laws, saying that, they need to be able to have staff on board. They can go toe to toe with industry and understand the industry and understand the supply chains and those challenges, just as well as the, engineers, the supply chain logisticians and everyone who works for the company, so that they can really get into the nitty gritty of it. And those just aren't skills that currently exist in the US federal government. So I think that that's a transferable lesson for Canada as well. There's also the data side of it. So the US has been, everyone has been talking about and hearing about supply chain mapping now for, I feel like since the COVID pandemic. I think you're finally starting to see tools come online, including those developed by government, particularly in the private sector, to be able to understand supply chains beyond the first and second tier suppliers. And I think for governments who are attempting what is a very complicated restructuring, reconfiguration here within these core sectors, to be able to understand the limitations, to be able to build the security that they're looking for and the resilience that they're looking for, you need to actually have a strong sense of where those choke points are and what the knock-on effects are, to make sure that you don't make huge mistakes. For companies, I would recommend hiring more compliance officers.
That's what every
Thanks,
company
Catherine.
wants to hear.
Yeah,
And all the consultants want to hear that, so that's great.
exactly.
Kristen.
Thanks. So I would say one opportunity area for the Canadian government is CPTPP. Canada is going to be taking over the chair of CPTPP next month in January at a really pivotal moment for the agreement. So the UK accession has just been completed. You now have these other accession bids on the table, and the real challenge for the group is to figure out how to manage these bids, particularly the bids of China and Taiwan. And I think, CPTPP accession is important at a global level in terms of trying to find ways to maintain and reinforce a rules-based trading system. Mega regional agreements like CPTPP are increasingly bearing the weight to try to do that. So CPTPP expansion is valuable for in that regard, reinforcing the rules-based system, trying to show support for a liberal trading order. It's also important for Canada in terms of meeting the goal of further diversifying our exports, reducing our dependence on the US and China, trying to expand market access into other markets is an important piece of that too. So CPTPP expansion is a good goal, and I think we should really be looking, as some folks mentioned yesterday, looking for creative solutions to try to manage these accession challenges. This is a place where Canada can show leadership in trying to manage this challenge for the group. And I think we need to really, in particular, focus on trying to find a way to move forward with Taiwan's accession bid. Taiwan has been, if we're looking at considering potential countries based on their ability to comply with the high standards of the agreement, based on their existing track records of complying with international trade commitments, there's no question that Taiwan has a very strong case to join the agreement. It's also been preparing very deeply for many years in order to make legal and regulatory reforms to bring its policies into compliance with CPTPP. We know, of course, China has been actively working to try to isolate Taiwan on the international stage, to try to prevent it from forming economic and political linkages with other states, and that's included trying to keep Taiwan out of trade agreements. So right now, Taiwan's excluded from two of the major trade agreements within the region, both CPTPP as well as RCEP. And that, over the long term, is increasingly going to be very harmful for Taiwan's economy. Taiwan's exports are placed at a major competitive disadvantage in the region. Ultimately, that'll make it a less attractive destination for investment, weaken its economic security, and ultimately render Taiwan weaker and more vulnerable. So this is a really important area where Canada could show leadership in trying to find a way to bring Taiwan into the agreement, try to give it market access to those CPTPP countries, which are some of the biggest economies in the world. This is something that could be very important for Taiwan. So I think CPTPP accession is an important opportunity for Canada to show leadership on the international stage.
Thank you, Kristen. So before we go to the floor for questions, perhaps I'll ask a last quick question. I won't pose the question to each panelist. I'll leave it up to you if you want to weigh in on this or not. But it seems like it begs the question on, business and government from the Canadian side need to be on the same page, right, in terms of capacity building, strategy, next steps to be more successful in the Indo-Pacific. So does that convergence, does that opportunity to share information, to strategize, is there a mechanism for that at the moment to do that successfully? And if not, should there be, and what should it look like? Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I can just a quick comment. I don't know if there's a mechanism. I know, but I do know there's an urgency, I think, in Canada to kind of differentiate between this is a conversation that's been going on this whole conference, but between interests and values and what it means in the region. And I was talking about over politicization, over securitization, but we also overvalue, what are Canadian values? And it seems that human rights and is thrown around very politically. And And we can have values in Asia, or Canadian values in Asia, but I think when we look at really what we've done successfully there, and we have a history of development examples, development aid, disaster management, real kind of people-to-people connections, business ties, that we support certain types of rights. But if we're going to be serious about dealing with countries in the Indo-Pacific, and I know the language of free and open is used in some contexts, but the reality is it's not. Countries there are not free and open. There's a lot of authoritarian, semi-authoritarian countries with really problematic human rights records. And so if we're going to take this kind of values-based statement, it's, who do we end up trading with in the end? So, and probably no one, and so I think, including ourselves, when we talk about that. So we have to be really clear, again, what we stand for. And Stephen talked about this. What does Canada bring? What do we bring? And just being kind of a bit less smug, for lack of better words, in this kind of Canadian way, and understanding that there's a lot of really dynamic countries there doing really interesting things that we can work with them.
Okay, great. Anybody? Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, I just want to jump off that because I think the mechanisms are things like the Canadian Chamber of the Asia Pacific, and our experience has been that people from GAC, they come in, they listen to our meetings, they listen to the concerns of the different chambers, and they understand, again, how each chamber has a different challenge within the Indo-Pacific region. And we can't really see it as a homogeneous business community, but rather a very heterogeneous business community that requires a more checkerboard approach to how we are thinking about trade and engagement. And this is where I think the Canadian government may be able to provide some financial resources to help build the local capacities, so that those local capacities, they can build up their capacity to have synergy with other parts of the Indo-Pacific. But again, it's a much more localized, heterogeneous approach where the government listens to the needs, maybe finds ways to shun resources to those chambers, and then the chambers build up the small and medium-sized enterprises, and then they send back that experience and that knowledge to the government in terms of helping them better tailor the policy. And I fully agree with Robert, is moving away from a values-based engagement within the region and thinking about this through how we can communicate Canadian values without using words like human rights and democracy. You want to work with the Vietnamese, you say, how can we help with good governance? Good governance is good enough for me. And we want them to have good governance, and good governance was likely going to help with human rights, and it's likely to have better representation. So how are we engaging with the region? Speak to those groups that have the experience and start to build the policy and the trade engagement based on that dialogue and listening to those that have their ears on the ground.
Good point. And certainly I do know that the IPS does have funding for local chambers, which is very good. And I think that local capacity building support is going to be really important. Any other thoughts on this before we move to the floor questions, Kristen?
I think one area, obviously, that's a big focus is diversification, trying to diversify Canada's exports. And here, I think Canadian government officials are doing a fantastic job, as are many provincial government officials as well. But I think it's important to recognize this is a massive undertaking. I mean, we're fighting against gravity here. The economic pull of the massive U.S. market, the massive Chinese market, it's extremely difficult to actually, have it make sense and make it possible for Canadian companies to increasingly export to other markets. So, there are important undertakings like AFC's new ag trade hub in the region. These are extremely important and will make a difference, but we have to recognize that this is very much a long-term process. This is something that will take many, many years to start to see real results. At this point, market access is only partially still about traditional things like tariffs. Increasingly, it's really about tackling individual technical barriers to trade, on a commodity by commodity, product by product, country by country basis. This is a really slow, painstaking process. And so diversification is the goal, but this is something that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time to actually try to achieve this.
Thank you. So we'll move to questions from the floor, if you don't mind identifying yourself. And since we have 5 panelists, maybe selecting a panelist or two who you'd like to address the question.
In some ways, this is a comment and question for the whole panel, because the topic was the trade security nexus. The first point is that the multilateral trading order was never designed to deal with security and great power competition. It evolved out of the GATT, which was a contractual arrangement among like-minded countries, all of which had a certain kind of rule of law basis. And it evolved into the WTO only after the end of the Cold War. And so all these issues we're talking about now the system was never designed for. There were national security exceptions built into that, to the old GATT, but those were considered to be exceptional and case-by-case basis. Now we have an entirely different world. And when we talk, for example, talking about balancing trade and security, balancing trade and security is politics, and it's entirely antithetical to a rules-based order. So you have one or you have the other. You can't have both. And so the question I have is, first of all, how do we get our language straight? What are we actually defending? If we're defending the rules-based order, then that's one thing. If we're defending security, that's another thing. And next, once we get beyond that issue, how do we actually make the rules-based order work under these kinds of situations?
And that is a big question. Who would like to take this one? Since it was addressed to everybody, maybe. Kristen? Yeah, okay.
I don't have an answer, but I have elaborating even more of the problem. There's a strong sense that the securitization of trade and the trade security nexus really emerged under Trump and with the shift in U.S. trade policy that we're seeing. But the reality is this issue emerged on the international stage and became extremely difficult and challenging for the multilateral trading system even before Trump. So the reality is that many aspects of China's trade policy have always been securitized. This isn't new. The sort of putting a priority on security objectives rather than economic objectives has often factored into many aspects of its trade policy. And not just in the big areas we would expect, like high-tech, advanced manufacturing, these sorts of things, but even in really basic things like agriculture and fisheries. So in agriculture, for example, China is now by far the world's biggest subsidizer of agriculture. It provides more subsidies than the entire OECD countries put together. So massive, massive scale. And these subsidies are very much driven by security objectives, food security, ensuring that it's not overly dependent on the US and allies in the event of a conflict. It doesn't want to be dependent on the US and others for grain and food security. And so it's really focused on bulking up its own food supply through subsidies and a whole host of other very protectionist trade policies. And so this became a hot issue at the World Trade Organization and really a major impediment to progress in WTO negotiations in the Doha round and afterwards, and a big source of the breakdown of those negotiations. Because China had these security objectives behind its trade policies, this wasn't just an economic issue where it could trade off the way you typically do in trade negotiations. Even agriculture was a security issue. That very much led to the breakdown of the negotiations, the inability to actually reach agreements, and we see that on a whole host of other areas. So beyond Trump, beyond the recent US turn in trade policy, this has been a real issue for the breakdown of the negotiation function of the WTO even before that.
Okay, thank you. We'll go on this side, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and
Yep.
thanks. Go ahead.
Yep. Karthik Nagy from National University of Singapore. I want to just broaden the discussion and talk about geoeconomic instruments. So two things that weren't mentioned were issues like investment screening. Other countries like the US have CFIUS that they're using to advance their own interests. Well, what's Canada doing on that front? I know that we have a law for that. Can we use it strategically? And related to that is digital trade. We talked a lot about trade, but trade and services. Issues like data, AI, cybersecurity. Again, other countries are using their own rules and standards, like the GDPR. The US really doesn't have a digital trade strategy, but once they do, they'll probably use it to advance their own interests. Where are we on that? Can we come up with some sort of a data strategy in the future to advance our own interest, or are we going to be kind of relying on whether it's European, US, or Chinese standards? Thanks.
Who would like to take that question? Anybody from our virtual panel?
Give it a shot.
Okay, Stephen.
It's a great question. I'll stick to the digital side of this discussion. Back at the G20 summit that took place in Osaka, the so-called data free flow with trust proposal was put on the table to try and create the broad framework of how we engage in the digital economy. And we've seen it gather a bit of momentum, but it's challenged. Not all the countries within the region are interested in regulating data in the same way. But I think there is a growing sense of understanding that at least the digital sphere of the economy could be bifurcated into a kind of China-based model where countries that are locked into the China-based digital infrastructure, and that has certain implications in terms of opportunity and speed of engagement and accessing, a market of 1.4 billion people or more. But there's also challenges in terms of data privacy and, how the state can engage, weaponize or abuse the data system. And the data free flow with trust was trying to create some regulations to, clearly define the relationship between government and that digital citizen, and ensure that the privacy was protected. This may be a potential way forward, depending on how many countries work together to try and create that critical mass that adopts shared standards. But I think really it's about building a critical mass of countries that are going to share the same norms and share the same understanding of the need to create the appropriate rules-based, transparent relationship between government and citizens in the digital sphere. And again, we'll need U.S. leadership. We'll likely need the European Union with their experience in regulating the internet. But we're also going to need other players to include in their voices in creating a digital economy and a digital sphere that really is and protects citizens from governments.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, so maybe I'll invite our people at the podiums to pose their questions one after the other, and then we'll get the panel to answer them.
Right, thanks. I'm Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. Very interested in the discussion about the CPTPP and how Canada can be creative in inviting Taiwan. But I think if realistically, the only way that Taiwan enters is to enter together with China, because the minute Taiwan enters first, China is going to walk away, I think. And if China enters first, they're going to block Taiwan. I think the only way is for them to both join. And if it's like inviting Taiwan to work groups, for instance, I can't see how China would say yes to that. Why does Canada think that it would be so easy? And if it was so easy, why couldn't New Zealand do it? And well, yeah, basically that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Maybe that's a good segue into mine. I'm Brent Jensen with Edmonton Global. Canadians and in this room, we're great at navel gazing and saying we're great, we're Canada, and we do. We have a lot of natural resources and vast amounts of potential. It seems like we get bottlenecked on the amount of policy that we have in place and our speed of doing business. And we miss out on a lot of opportunities. What can we be doing better right now in order to make sure that those opportunities do actually come to fruition? And if it's critical minerals, for example, where it doesn't take 15 years to advance those projects, or in moving our products to market, let's say hydrogen, agriculture, or forestry products. What do we need right now in order to actually play on a world stage instead of just talk on a world stage?
Good question. Thank you.
A retired trade negotiator, trade commissioner, so it means I'm old. I have a comment and then a question. The comment is, sitting in the green room in Geneva in the 70s and listening to the Americans beat up on the Europeans about liberalizing and globalization, it was a good 5-decade run, but the last 2 decades have been about America pulling back from globalization and all of us figuring out how to serve our interests. I don't have an easy answer on that, but I think friendshoring is more of the nativist solutions that aren't long-term or unwise. My question is, the World Trade Organization Director General has made a very astute comment, and she's African, so she looks at it from a very different perspective, that the organization can't solve this problem of where we're going. The Americans have over 1,000 Chinese firms sanctioned. We've run into sanctions and it's helped destroy some of our great firms. It's not a good solution to trade. That's a further comment. The question is, if the WTO or some similar organization is going to bring some sanity to the world, particularly to the region of the Asian century that is committed to globalization, we are going to. Great countries, superpowers, are going to have to work this out. And I'm not seeing a lot of discussion of that. We seem to be walking away from the reality of what a rules-based order means when the largest player is busy defenestrating the only trade settlements capacity the globe has managed to generate in a century. So the question is, do you see any hope for talking more seriously of what the world really needs to get a working, functional, accountable system? And it's easy to say, but I'm retired 20 years, so it's easier to look big and dream naively.
Thank you. Well, we have a couple minutes left. Hopefully we can end on a positive note, and the answer will be yes, there is hope. Any thoughts on any of those three questions? Stephen, I think you're raising your hand.
Yeah, I sure
Okay.
am.
Okay.
I'll just address Ken Morias's question from the Nikkei Asia. It's a great question. How does Canada advocate for trade as the chair of the TPP moving forward? In the case of Taiwan's, the choice over Taiwan, I think it may be useful to think about how China has engaged in its own BRI, the Belt Road Initiative initiatives. It's gone out and it's reached out to states, it's reached out to cities, and it's reached out to those cities and states to build infrastructure without liaising with the central government. And Australia is a great example. When they wanted to build infrastructure for the state of Victoria, they didn't go to Canberra, they went straight to Victoria. And we can still, we may be able to use this kind of logic in the inclusion of Taiwan into the TPP by saying we acknowledge the one China policy, but we're just following your model of engaging with other states and cities and provinces of different countries without negotiating with the central government. I think we need to be creative. We need to understand how the Chinese are doing this and apply the same rules that we can decrease the resistance to including Taiwan or other entities into the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Thank you. Perhaps a last word, David.
Yeah, I'm happy to take the last question about U.S. retreat and what needs to happen at the multilateral level. I think you're exactly right. I think that there has been a now sustained period really since late 1990s, arguably 2001, with the vote for China's accession to the WTO in the U.S., where there has been sort of a real domestic political deadlock that has frustrated U.S. efforts and ambitions to continue playing a leadership role in the international economic system. And I think there are no easy solutions. I mean, the one area that I take hope in is that you do see, Deputy Ministerial meetings, you see Catherine Tai, amongst others, still saying and suggesting that they are working towards some resolution to this impasse next year. I will believe it when I see it. I think that there are just a huge number of boundaries here. I think going back to one of the conversations earlier, I think that one area that would prove very controversial, but is likely would need to happen to have some kind of resolution is, I think, a rebalancing of the sort of balance between judicialization and politics within the WTO. I think that given the level of dispute and disagreement between the US and China over sort of the current state of the system, that the reintroduction of some additional level of sort of political maneuvering, I don't think we're going to be going all the way back to the gap, but I see it as almost inevitable as a way to come up with this impasse. I think US concerns over the appellate body, as was previously mentioned, frankly date all the way back into the 1990s and started to really grow in the early 2000s, not just around China, but there's a famous banana case that that's just really started to trigger a lot of these concerns in the US. So I think that there's that. I think the other thing that you'll need to see, and this is something that my good friend Matthew Klein has written about extensively with Michael Pettis, is I think for there to be progress at the multilateral level, needs to be closer linkage of trade and macro issues. I think what's underlying a lot of these trade disputes are actually these bigger macro dynamics stemming from excess capacity, stemming from a whole bunch of other issues. And I think that it's going to be impossible to come to some type of resolution, particularly as you see China's domestic economy starting to slow. I think looking ahead for the next 5 years, concerns over excess capacity, concerns over sort of Chinese dumping and exports are only going to grow. Europe is already seeing this, I think, in the auto industry, which the U.S. is effectively locked out, as was also mentioned earlier. So I think those are the two things that I would look to, I think, for success. One is closer linkage of trade and macro. And I think the second is this rebalancing of what some argue is an over-judicialization of the trade system and this reintroduction of I think, a more sort of diplomatic dispute resolution system, which is also the direction that you're seeing the U.S. go on some of the multilateral and unilateral agreements that have been negotiated.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all of our 5 panelists, Stephen, Ari, David, Robert, Kristen. Very insightful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.